Fieldorf also gave the orders, directed the daring public assassination of Franz Kuchera, who was one of the most notorious SS executioners in Warsaw. After the war, Fieldorf was arrested. There was a sham amnesty program. He was enticed to come in. He was arrested and tortured, and then publicly labeled a Nazi collaborator and executed. Another example would be Witold Pilecki, who volunteered to become a prisoner in Auschwitz, where he organized a resistance movement in the infamous camp that gathered evidence of the Holocaust and organized prisoner escapes. Once again, Pilecki was denounced after the war as a traitor. Publicly, he was tortured and executed, again, as a quote-unquote Nazi collaborator. So ironically, quite a number of the people who were joined the communist security forces, many of them had actually been Nazi collaborators. There was the best known, of course, Bolesław Piasecki, who was a pre-war fascist who became a communist official after the war. At the same time, the experiences of the minuscule communist resistance movement, very often in older history books, you'll see some mention of the Armia Ludowa and its earlier version, the Gwarda Ludowa. But this was a minor feature compared to the AK throughout the war. But this minuscule resistance movement, the leaders of it were promoted and turned into national heroes, even though they were essentially agents of a hostile foreign power, that is the Soviet Union. A largely falsified history that emphasized communist achievement was intended to replace the long-agreed understanding of the Polish past. It was promoted in books, articles, movies, poems, novels, and of course official school curricula and public monuments. By contrast, the uprising in Warsaw's Jewish ghetto in 1943 proved far less problematic to the communist authorities. Of course, the official account of the ghetto uprising scrubbed away the fact that the most effective Jewish resistance had been put up by the right-wing Zionist revisionist, the Betarim, who had been supported by the AK and had emphasized the less successful but left-leaning Jewish fighting organization. It was also very convenient that many of those leaders were dead, and so they could essentially make of them what they wished. And it promoted the notion that the Polish underground had been hostile or indifferent to the Jewish resistance, when in fact it had been indifferent to some parts of it and it supported others. The notion of a specifically Jewish resistance also faded into the background in the favor of a more broad-based anti-fascist orientation. And this was in keeping with the communists' larger effort to downplay the specifically anti-Jewish nature of the Holocaust. There's been a lot written about this, about how, in a sense, Auschwitz, if you went to Auschwitz before the fall of communism, there was really very little mention of it being Jewish or specifically Jewish victims. They were all kind of grouped together into national groupings. This was by design. Quite a bit's been written about that. The ghetto uprising also proved a useful way to distract attention from the larger, more significant Warsaw uprising, creating a degree of confusion in some Western observers that exists to this day. The President of Germany, at the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw uprising, the President of Germany was invited to come to the commemorations, and he said, well, I'd be happy to come to the commemorations of the ghetto uprising. Poles felt obviously somewhat insulted by that. But this was actually, there's a precedent for this in that there was a massacre in a village in Belarus by the Nazis called Katyn, which sounds very similar to Katyn, which where the Soviets massacred and Polish officers. And the Soviets promoted this massacre of local Belarusian villagers as a way to kind of distract or distort kind of public attention from the Katyn massacre, which they had committed. Thus, in 1948, the authorities permitted the establishment of a monument to the heroes of the ghetto uprising, and I'll show you a picture of that and get some visual. This is still a very well-known monument if you go to Warsaw today. This is it's at the site of the former ghetto, and there's a number of other monuments that since have been put up around this. This was the original. After Stalin's death, and beginning during the Gomulka era, overt attacks. This is the late 1950s, early 1960s. Overt attacks on the non-communist resistance ended, and some former resistance figures were posthumously rehabilitated. But the uprising almost completely disappeared from public discourse in Poland. Here was an event which had utterly reshaped the physical landscape and demography of Poland's capital city, yet it remained publicly almost invisible. In other words, I mean, the city of Warsaw was destroyed. If you go to Warsaw today, what you'll see is reconstructed. I mean, especially the old town, the historic districts are entirely reconstructed. The city had been leveled. But here was this event which had caused this. But in fact, even though they were rebuilding all of these parts of the city quite meticulously and quite nicely in many respects, there was no mention of how this had all happened, which is, sort of very, complete disconnect from reality. There were no real histories published. There were a few mentions in memoirs or articles, but really the articles had very little circulation. They weren't very in-depth. You didn't have historians writing lengthy monographs, for example, on the Warsaw Uprising to any great extent. Due to its incalculable human and material losses, the Rising was an inescapable fact of life in Warsaw during 45 years of communist rule. On virtually every street corner, visitors could find plaques commemorating those who lost to Nazi crimes, with inscriptions listing how many people were murdered and on what day. Yet there was not a single public monument or plaque dedicated to the Rising until after the fall of communism. The event was not commemorated in any public way. At best, official historiography belittled the Rising as a tragic mistake by incompetent leaders. Now, there were some exceptions to this, and they're worthy of mention. One is private family memory. And particularly, people would get the official version of history in school, and they come home in the evening or on the weekends, sit around the family dinner table, and they hear the other version of history, what actually happened or what happened to our family. In churches, there were monuments, and of course, immigrants in Polonia abroad. And I'll show you an interesting. This is as far as I know, this was the only mention of the Warsaw prior to the fall of communism. The only mention of the Rising on a public street in Warsaw. And there may have been something tucked away in some other corner that I don't know about. It was very, very obscure. This is the only one that I know about. This is at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the Old Town, which was the scene of some of the most ferocious fighting. This building, of course, it was a medieval church, and incredibly thick walls made it an ideal fortress. Nazis would come up with blasted at point-blank range with tanks and have absolutely no effect. And it was held so intensely. The SS launched attack after the group Durlawanger launched attack after attack on this structure, and they were beaten back each time with heavy losses. They actually, some of the German commanders believed that the position was being held by a unit of commandos that had been parachuted in from England. That was how firmly it was held. They eventually blew up the building using a remote-controlled tank, called a little miniature tank, packed with explosives, called the Goliath, that rammed into the building and essentially brought it down. When they went through the rubble, they found the bodies of the defenders, all of them dressed in their Boy Scout uniforms. But this is a tread of a tank that was discovered during the rebuilding, and it was placed in the wall with this plaque. It's on a little side alley, but the significant thing is it's in a church. Okay, it's not any kind of public building. This was placed in there, and in a sense, it's sort of on church property, sort of, if you will. This is the one that's sort of the exception to the rule. Of really having no memorials whatsoever. And of course, emigres, Polonia abroad, kept some memory of it alive, at least in the West, and some of that did filter into Poland, especially in clandestine publications and translations of things from the West. So the communists, throughout this 45-year period, kept the monopoly of the public square. And all this private and family memory of the Warsaw Uprising was, in a sense, isolated. It was balkanized. So people didn't talk. They didn't go out in public and talk about this. Or if you did, it was very, very limited circumstance, very kind of small group of friends and family. And so it was a very isolated kind of memory. There was no kind of collective public memory of this.